Valeth Corin had calculated war for 12,000 years. And in all that time, he had never once known fear. Because fear was inefficient, a weakness that clouded judgment and led to poor decisions. And the Silthari did not permit such things in their commanders. His species had mastered the mathematics of conflict long before humans had learned to make fire. And every battle was simply an equation to be solved. Every death a variable in a greater calculation. Every victory a predictable outcome of superior planning. He stood now in the command center of Velner Station, watching data streams flow across holographic displays. His four-fingered hands clasped behind his back in the traditional posture of a Silthari officer. His silver eyes scanning the information with the cold precision his kind were famous for. Coalition had assigned him to this joint operation with human forces. A decision he had accepted without complaint but also without enthusiasm. Because humans were a young species, barely spacefaring for 2 centuries. Emotional and chaotic in their approach to everything. Including warfare, they fought with their hearts instead of their minds. And Valeth considered this a fundamental flaw in their design. The briefing had been straightforward enough. As the Drath Collective was converging on Velner Station with a fleet that outnumbered the defenders 3-1, and the hive-minded creatures would consume everything in their path. If they broke through, Valeth had run the numbers immediately, calculating their odds of survival at 14%. A figure he noted in his tactical log. Without any emotional response whatsoever, 14% was low, but not impossible. And he would work with whatever probability the universe provided. The door to the command center slid open, and Valeth turned to observe the human squad that had been assigned to his direct command. 4 soldiers in worn combat armor that showed the marks of previous battles. The man in front was Sergeant Jack Morrison, a human male in his middle 30s, with a face that looked like it had been weathered by hard years and harder decisions. His brown hair cut short in military fashion. His green eyes carrying a sharpness that Valeth found mildly acceptable. Behind him stood Corporal Laura Bennett, the squad's combat medic, a woman with red hair pulled back tight and a jaw set in what humans called determination. Her medical kit strapped to her back alongside her rifle. Then came Private First Class Daniel Cruz, young and fresh-faced, clearly on his first real deployment. Though he held himself with more steadiness than Valeth had expected, the sergeant stepped forward and extended his hand in the human greeting gesture. And Valeth regarded it for a moment before accepting the contact, finding the ritual strange but harmless. "Commander Corin," Jack said with a casual nod. "Good to be working with you, and I hear you Silthari really know how to run a battle." Valeth released the handshake and returned his hands to their position behind his back. "I have commanded 743 engagements across my career," he replied, his voice carrying the measured tones of his species. "And I have achieved victory in 712 of them, so yes, I believe I am competent." Lavra leaned toward Daniel and whispered something that Valeth's sensitive hearing easily detected. "Our new commander has all the warmth of a frozen airlock," she said. And Daniel suppressed what humans called a smile. Valeth chose not to acknowledge the comment, as it was irrelevant to their mission. And emotional warmth had no place in tactical planning. "You will follow my orders precisely," Valeth told them. "And you will not deviate from established protocols, because deviation introduces chaos. And chaos reduces our probability of survival." Jack nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he was not entirely convinced. "We follow orders, Commander, but we also adapt to situations as they develop. Because that is how humans fight. Adaptation within parameters is acceptable." Valeth conceded, "But reckless action is not. And I have observed that humans are prone to reckless action when emotions become involved." Before Jack could respond, an alarm cut through the command center, sharp and insistent. And Valeth turned immediately to the tactical display. The Drath fleet had appeared on long-range sensors, emerging from faster-than-light travel in a swarm of bioorganic vessels that blackened the star field like a plague. They were early, arriving 6 hours ahead of the projected timeline, which meant someone's intelligence had been flawed. Velith adjusted his calculations instantly, watching the numbers shift in his mind as he factored in the new variables. "The odds have changed," he announced to the room, "and our probability of survival has dropped to 9%. He noted this figure with the same detachment he had noted the previous one, because 9% was simply a different number. And numbers did not require emotional responses. Lieutenant Katie Marsh, the tactical coordinator aboard the Coalition command ship in orbit, appeared on the communication screen, her face tight with what Velith recognized as human concern. "Velner Station. We are seeing the Drath fleet on our scopes, and they are moving faster than anticipated," she reported. "So you need to prepare for engagement within the hour." "Understood," Velith replied. "And we will proceed according to Defensive Protocol 7, which maximizes our defensive coverage while minimizing resource expenditure." Jack Morrison stepped up beside him, studying the tactical display with those sharp green eyes. "That is a lot of them," he said quietly. And there was something in his voice that was not fear exactly, but perhaps respect for the enemy's numbers. 347 vessels, Velith confirmed, against our 41, but numbers alone do not determine outcomes. "And I have won battles against worse odds." That was not entirely true, as he had never faced odds quite this severe. But the statement served to maintain morale among the humans, which was apparently important to their performance. Daniel Cruz was checking his rifle, his young face set in concentration, and Lara was reviewing her medical supplies with the efficiency of someone who expected to use them. Soon Jack turned to his squad and gave them a nod that seemed to communicate something Velith could not quite interpret. "All right, people," the sergeant said. "We have been in tough spots before, and we have always come out the other side. So let us show these Droth what happens when they pick a fight with humanity." The squad responded with sounds of agreement, a ritual that Velith found pointless, but chose not to interrupt. He returned his attention to the tactical display, watching the Drath fleet grow larger on the sensors, and he began calculating the optimal defensive positions, the ideal firing solutions, the mathematical framework that would give them the best chance of survival. 9% was not good, but it was not 0. And Velith had never lost a battle he was mathematically capable of winning. He did not know then that mathematics would fail him in this fight, that the humans beside him would introduce variables he had never considered, that before this battle ended, he would experience something his species had not felt in millennia. He did not know that he was about to learn the meaning of terror, but he would learn it soon enough. The Drath assault began with a wave of smaller vessels that crashed against the station's shields, like insects against glass, their bioorganic hulls burning as they sacrificed themselves to weaken the defensive barriers. Velith watched from the command center, issuing precise orders based on his optimal survival mathematics, directing fire teams to key positions and coordinating shield power distribution with mechanical efficiency. Everything proceeded according to his models for the first 47 minutes, and he allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction at the accuracy of his predictions. Then Sector 7 shields failed. The collapse came 12 minutes ahead of his projections, a deviation that Velith found troubling. And before he could adjust his calculations, the Drath had already begun their boarding assault. Breach alarms screamed throughout the station as enemy forces poured through the ruptured hull, their chitinous bodies flooding the corridors like a tide of claws and teeth. Velith studied the tactical display and made his decision within 3 seconds, because hesitation cost lives, and he had never been one to hesitate. All forces withdraw from Sectors 7 and 8. He ordered through the communication system and established secondary defensive lines at junction points 12 through 15, as we will consolidate our position and sacrifice the compromised areas. It was the mathematically sound choice. Trading space for time and accepting minimal losses to prevent greater ones. A strategy that had served him well in hundreds of previous engagements. Jack Morrison's voice came back over the channel immediately, and there was something hard in it that Valith had not heard before. Negative on that order. Commander, because we have civilian workers trapped in Sector 7, and we are moving to extract them. Valith felt a flicker of irritation, an emotion he rarely experienced and quickly suppressed. Sergeant Morrison, there are 12 civilians in that sector and 6 soldiers in your squad, he replied. And risking 6 trained combat personnel to save 12 non-combatants is mathematically unsound, as the probability of successful extraction is less than 20%. There was a pause on the channel, and then Jack spoke again. That is not how humans fight, Commander. The channel went silent, and Valith watched on the tactical display as the 4 markers representing Morrison's squad moved toward the breach instead of away from I, considered ordering them to halt, considered threatening disciplinary action, considered all the logical arguments he could make. But something told him the humans would not listen so. Instead, he simply watched. The camera feeds from Sector 7 showed chaos, with Drath creatures swarming through the corridors and civilian workers running in panic, their screams audible even through the audio filters. Then the humans arrived. Jack Morrison came around the corner first, his rifle already firing, and the sound of human weapons was somehow different from the precise pulse fire of Siltery technology. Louder and angrier and full of something Valith could not name. Laura Bennett was right behind him, her red hair wild beneath her helmet, and she was shouting something in a human language that the translator rendered as encouragement to the trapped civilians. Daniel Cruz and the 4th squad member, a woman named Sandra Wells, took flanking positions and began laying down suppressive fire that pushed the draft back. Valith expected to witness their quick deaths, because his calculations said they could not survive against those numbers, because everything he knew about warfare told him they were making a fatal mistake. But his calculations were wrong. The humans fought with a ferocity that defied his mathematical models, a raw and terrible violence that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training or discipline. Jack took a drath claw across his armor and responded by driving the butt of his rifle into the creature's skull with enough force to crack the chitinous plating. Laura dragged 2 civilians toward cover while firing her sidearm with her other hand. Her face twisted into an expression that was not fear, but something closer to fury. Daniel went down when a drath caught his shoulder with its razor appendage, and Valith watched the wound open red across the young soldier's flesh, watched the blood begin to flow, and prepared to mark him as a casualty. But Daniel did not fall. Instead, the young human screamed something wordless and savage and drove his combat knife into the creature's throat, twisting the blade with both hands until the drath collapsed. He kept fighting after that, his wounded arm hanging at his side, his good arm still swinging that bloody knife at anything that came close. Sandra Wells picked up a fallen drath limb and used it as a club when her rifle overheated, beating the creatures back with their own dead flesh. The civilians were moving now, stumbling toward the extraction point, with Jack shouting directions and Laura physically pulling the slowest ones along. Valith watched all of this on his displays, his silver eyes tracking every movement, every impossible survival, every defiance of probability. His models had not accounted for this. They had not accounted for humans who took wounds that should incapacitate them and kept fighting, for soldiers who ran toward danger instead of away from it, for beings who seemed to grow stronger the more desperate their situation became. The extraction took 11 minutes and 34 seconds. And at the end of it, all 12 civilians were safe behind the secondary defensive line. And all 4 members of Jack's squad were still alive, wounded, bleeding, exhausted. But Alavelith stared at the tactical display for a long moment, running the numbers again in his mind, trying to understand how they had succeeded when everything said they should have failed. Jack's voice came over the channel again, and he was breathing hard, but there was something like satisfaction in his tone. Sector 7 civilians extracted. Commander, and we are falling back to Junction 12 to reinforce the defensive line. Velith opened his mouth to respond, to acknowledge the report with his usual measured tones. But the words would not come immediately. Acknowledged, he finally said, and his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. And well done, Sergeant Morrison. He had never said those words to a subordinate before, had never felt the need to offer praise for simply completing an objective. But something about what he had witnessed demanded recognition. Jack did not respond, probably too busy tending to his wounded squad. And Velith was left alone with his thoughts. His calculations had been wrong. And the Silthari did not make calculation errors. Not in 12,000 years of warfare. Not ever. But somehow the humans had introduced a variable that his mathematics could not account for. Something that turned 20% odds into successful extraction. Something that made wounded soldiers keep fighting when they should have stopped. Velith did not have a name for it yet. Did not understand what he had witnessed. But he knew that his models would need revision, because clearly there was something about humans that could not be calculated. The draft pushed deeper into Velner Station with every passing hour, and Velith's defensive lines crumbled exactly as his projections had predicted, sector by sector, corridor by corridor. A slow and methodical collapse that he had calculated down to the minute. What he had not projected was that the humans would hold there. Positions Junction 12 had been scheduled to fall at hour 3. But Jack Morrison's squad had turned it into a fortress of blood and defiance. And the draft had broken against them like waves against a cliff. It was now hour 5. And Junction 12 still held. Velith had stopped trying to calculate how this was possible, because his mathematics gave him only impossible answers. Numbers that contradicted themselves and refused to make sense. He had more immediate concerns now, as the forward command post needed direct supervision, and he could not coordinate the central defense from the main command center. Any longer. 2 Silthari guards flanked him as he moved through the corridors, their pulse rifles held in the precise two-handed grip that their training demanded. Their movements efficient and economical. They were good soldiers, disciplined and skilled. And Velith had calculated their combat effectiveness at 87% optimal. The draft found them at corridor 9. The breach came from above, through a ventilation shaft that should have been too small for the creatures. But the draft had sent their smaller variants, the ones that moved fast and struck hard and died easily, but always in such numbers. Velith's guards opened fire immediately, their pulse rifles sending precise bolts of energy into the swarming mass. And for a moment, it seemed like they might hold. Then more draft came from behind, cutting off their retreat. And Velith understood with cold clarity that they were surrounded. His guards fought well. Their movements textbook perfect, their shots finding their marks with mechanical accuracy. But perfection was not enough against these numbers. And one by one they fell. The first guard took a claw through his chest, his silver blood spraying across the corridor walls as he collapsed. Second lasted 11 seconds longer before 3 draft brought him down together, their chitinous limbs tearing through his armor like paper. Velith drew his sidearm and fired, dropping 2 of the creatures with shots that struck their central nerve clusters. But more kept coming, always more. An endless tide of claws and teeth and hunger. He calculated his remaining ammunition against the number of enemies and found the mathematics unfavorable. Found himself facing death with the same detachment he had faced everything else in his long life. He would die here, in this corridor, surrounded by Drath, and that was simply how the equation resolved. He accepted this outcome without complaint. Because acceptance was the Silthery way. Because emotions served no purpose in the face of mathematical certainty, then the humans arrived, the sound reached him first. A roar of gunfire and shouting voices that echoed through the corridor like thunder. And the Drath turned toward this new threat with their hunting instincts screaming. Jack Morrison came through the swarm, like a force of nature, his rifle blazing, his face twisted into an expression that Valeth had never seen on any species. Something primal and terrible and completely without calculation. Laura Bennett was beside him, firing and moving, her boots slipping in the silver blood of the fallen Silthery guards, but never losing her balance. Daniel Cruz still had his shoulder bandaged from the earlier fight, but he fought with his good arm as if the wound did not exist. As if pain was simply another enemy to be ignored. Sandra Wells had acquired a Drath blade from somewhere and was using it alongside her rifle, switching between ranged and close combat with a fluidity that seemed almost choreographed. The Drath that had been moments from killing Valeth now found themselves fighting on two fronts, and the humans gave them no time to adapt. Jack reached Valeth first, grabbing the Silthery commander by the arm and pulling him toward cover behind a structural support beam. "Stay down," Jack shouted, and his voice carried authority that even Valeth found himself obeying. Laura took a hit meant for Valeth, a Drath claw that raked across her back and tore through her armor. And the Silthery watched her stumble forward with blood beginning to soak through her uniform, but she did not fall, did not stop, did not even slow down. She turned and emptied her magazine into the Drath that had wounded her, then drew her sidearm and kept firing until that was empty too. And only then did she allow herself to lean against the wall and catch her breath. Daniel ran out of ammunition and responded by beating a Drath to death with his empty rifle, swinging the weapon like a club until the creature stopped moving, until its chitinous shell was cracked and broken, until there was nothing left to fight. Sandra cleared the last of them with precise shots that contradicted the chaos around her, her face calm even as silver and red blood mixed on the floor at her feet. And then it was over. The corridor silent except for heavy breathing and the distant sounds of battle elsewhere in the station. Jack turned to Valeth, and there was blood on his face, some of it his own and some of it not. But his eyes were still sharp and alive. "You all right, Commander?" he asked, and the question seemed genuine despite everything. Valeth looked at him, at this human who had risked his life and the lives of his squad for a Silthery officer they had known for less than a day, and found himself without adequate words. "You came for me," Valeth said, and his voice sounded strange even to himself. "But why? When the tactical situation did not require my survival, when saving me offered no strategic advantage." Jack shrugged, a gesture that Valeth had learned indicated casual dismissal of a question's premise. "We do not leave people behind," Jack said simply. Valeth processed this statement and found it insufficient. "I am not people to you," he replied. "I am an alien commander, a different species, a being you have known for mere hours. So why would you risk your lives for mine?" Jack reached out and clasped Valeth's shoulder, a gesture of connection that the Silthery had never experienced from anyone outside his own kind. "You are on our side," Jack said, "and that makes you people." Then he grinned, blood staining his teeth, and added, "Now let us get you somewhere safe before more of those things show up." Valeth followed the humans as they moved through the corridor, stepping over Drath corpses and fallen guards. And he noticed something strange happening in his chest. A coldness was spreading there, an unfamiliar sensation that had no place in his carefully ordered mind. And he did not know what it meant. He did not recognize it as the beginning of terror. Not yet. Velner Station was falling, and even Valeth's mathematics could not deny it anymore. 23 minutes remained before total overrun. 23 minutes before the Drath consumed everything and everyone still trapped inside. And Valeth found himself in the secondary command center running calculations that offered no hope. He recommended evacuation of essential personnel, accepting necessary losses as the only viable strategy. His voice carrying the same measured tones it always had even as he sentenced some of his people to death. Katie Marsh's face appeared on the communication screen. Her expression tight with something humans call desperation. "Commander Corinne, we are trying to arrange extraction," she reported. "But our dropships cannot land until the main hangar is secured. And right now that hangar is completely overrun with Drath." Valeth studied the tactical display showing the hangar, watching the mass of Drath signatures that filled the space like a living carpet. Calculating the force needed to clear such an infestation, you would require approximately 200 trained soldiers to secure that position, he replied. And we do not have those numbers available. Katie nodded grimly on the screen. How many do we have? She asked. 31, Valeth said, including the wounded, which brings our effective fighting strength to perhaps 23. There was silence on the channel for a moment, and Valeth watched the timer counting down in his mind. 21 minutes now. 20 minutes and 40 seconds. Jack Morrison entered the secondary command center with his squad behind him, all of them bearing fresh wounds and old blood stains. All of them looking like they had already fought through several lifetimes of combat. "I heard the situation," Jack said, and his voice was calm despite everything. "And I have a plan." Valeth turned to face him, noting the way the sergeant held himself, the steadiness in his green eyes that had not diminished despite the impossible odds. "There are hundreds of Drath in that hangar," Valeth replied. "And you have 31 soldiers, most of them wounded. So what plan could possibly succeed against those numbers?" Jack looked at his squad, at Laura, who was still bleeding through her bandages, at Daniel, who could barely lift his rifle with his wounded arm, at Sandra, who had run out of ammunition 3 times already. Then he looked back at Valeth. "We going hard and fast," Jack said. "Hit them with everything we have, and do not stop moving until the hangar is clear, or we are all dead." Valeth processed this strategy and found it severely lacking. "That is suicide," he said flatly. Jack nodded, and something like a smile crossed his bloodied face. "Probably," he agreed. "But it is also the only chance those civilians have. And we do not get to quit just because the odds are bad." Valeth felt that cold sensation in his chest again, stronger now, spreading through him like ice water in his veins. "Why would you throw away your lives for a 9% chance of success?" he demanded, and his voice cracked slightly on the words in a way that had never happened before. "Why would you choose certain death over survival?" Laura stepped forward, her red hair matted with sweat and blood, her eyes burning with something Valeth could not name. "Where we come from," she said quietly. "People have won with worse odds." Then she turned and followed Jack out of the command center, and Daniel limped after her. And Sandra checked her borrowed Drath blade one more time before joining them. Valeth watched them go, watched them gather the other human forces in the corridor outside, watched Jack give a short speech that the translator rendered as something about honor and duty, and never backing down. Then, the humans charged toward the hangar. Valeth moved to the tactical displays, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled up the camera feeds, needing to see what happened next, even though every part of his logical mind screamed at him to look away. Humans hit the Drath line like a thunderbolt, their weapons blazing, their voices raised in screams and battle cries that echoed through the station speakers. The first wave of defenders fell immediately. 5 humans cut down in the opening seconds, but the others kept moving, kept firing, kept pushing forward through the impossible resistance. Jack was at the front, always at the front, his rifle singing death into the Drath swarm. his boots never stopping their forward motion. Even when claws reached for his throat, Laura stayed close to him. Watching his back, her medical training forgotten now in favor of simple, brutal combat, Daniel fought like a man possessed. His wounded arm forgotten, his knife finding Drath throats with mechanical regularity. The Drath fell by the dozens. But more kept coming, always more. And the human numbers dropped with terrible speed. 23 became 1919, became 1515, became 11. Velith watched the markers disappear from his tactical display. Each one representing a human life extinguished. Each one a variable subtracted from his calculations. And something inside him began to crack. Daniel fell. A Drath caught him across the legs, bringing him down hard, and his wounded body could not recover in time, could not rise before two more creatures converged on his position. Velith saw it happen on the camera feed, saw the young soldier struggling to raise his knife one more time, saw the Drath closing in for the kill, and then Lara did something that broke every mathematical model Velith had ever constructed. She ran into the open. No cover, no protection, no calculation whatsoever. Just desperate screaming, need to reach her friend. Her rifle cut down both Drath before they could strike. And she grabbed Daniel's arm and began dragging him toward cover. Her back completely exposed to enemy fire. 3 Drath claws found her as she moved. One in her shoulder, one in her side, one across her back. And Velith watched her blood spray across the hangar floor in patterns that should have meant death. But she did not stop. She kept dragging Daniel, kept moving, kept refusing to fall until she had pulled him behind a cargo container where Sandra could cover them both. Then she called upset. Velith's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the console, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow, and his chest felt like something was crushing it from the inside. He did not understand what was happening to him, did not recognize the symptoms, did not know why watching these humans fight and fall was affecting him like this. Then, he named it terror, not fear of his own death, because he had faced that without flinching, but terror of watching them die. Terror of losing these impossible creatures who fought with their hearts instead of their minds. Terror of existing in a universe where Jack Morrison and Laura Bennett and Daniel Cruz no longer drew breath 12,000 years. And Velith had never felt anything like this. 12,000 years. And the humans had taught him terror in a single day on the tactical display. The hangar was almost clear. 8 humans still standing against the final Drath resistance. And Velith watched them fight with a desperation that matched his own. He watched them, and he felt terror, and somewhere in the depths of his ancient mind, something fundamental changed forever. The hangar was nearly clear when Velith made his decision, a decision that defied 12,000 years of silvery military doctrine. That contradicted every mathematical principle he had ever learned. That made absolutely no logical sense whatsoever. He picked up a fallen human rifle from one of his dead guards and walked out of the command center. The weapon felt strange in his 4-fingered hands, heavier than silvery pulse rifles and rougher in its construction. But he had observed the humans using these tools enough to understand the basic mechanics. Point at the enemy and pull the trigger until they stop moving. It was a crude philosophy of combat, entirely without elegance or precision, and Velith found himself appreciating it for the first time. Reached the hangar entrance as the final Drath surge threatened to overwhelm the survivors. 8 humans holding a ragged line against twice their number and screaming chitinous horrors. Jack was still standing. Somehow still standing, his armor torn in a dozen places, and his blood mixing with Drath ichor on the deck plates. But his rifle kept firing with mechanical determination. Laura was conscious again, propped against a cargo container with Daniel beside her. Both of them shooting with whatever weapons they could still lift. Sandra had acquired a second Drath blade and was fighting with both hands now. A whirlwind of stolen edges that kept the creatures at bay. Velith did not announce his presence. did not call out a greeting or battle cry, did not waste breath on words that served no tactical purpose. He simply raised his rifle and began shooting. His aim was terrible, his stance all wrong, his trigger discipline non-existent. And he missed more shots than he hit in those first few seconds. But he stood with Thema Drath, noticed him, and charged. All claws and teeth and hunger, and Valeth shot it 4 times before it finally fell, using 3 more rounds than necessary because he did not know how to aim properly. Another came from his left, and he barely turned in time. Barely got his rifle around before the creature was on him, and then Jack was there, putting 3 precise shots into its skull before pulling Valeth behind cover. "Your stance is terrible," Jack said. And despite everything, despite the blood and the death and the terror, the human was grinning. Valeth found himself making a sound he did not recognize. Something that might have been laughter if Silthery were capable of such things. "I am aware," he replied, "but I am learning." The final Drath fell 3 minutes and 17 seconds later, brought down by Sandra's blades and the combined fire of every human still capable of pulling a trigger. The hangar was clear. The evacuation could begin. Valeth stood among the human survivors, his borrowed rifle still clutched in his trembling hands, and looked around at what remained of the force that had attempted this impossible assault. 8 humans stood from the 31, who had charged into the hangar. 8 out of 31, a casualty rate that should have been unacceptable by any military standard. But they had won. The dropships began landing within minutes. Coalition pilots who had been waiting for this moment, and medical teams rushed out to tend to the wounded with efficiency born of desperate practice. Laura was carried aboard on a stretcher, her eyes closed but her chest still rising and falling with breath. And the medics said she would live if they could get her to proper facilities in time. Daniel limped onto the dropship under his own power, refusing assistance despite his wounds, his young face aged by what he had seen and done today. Sandra sat down heavily on a cargo crate and simply stared at nothing, her borrowed blades still clutched in hands that would not stop shaking. Jack stood at the dropship ramp, counting his people as they boarded, making sure everyone was accounted for before he would allow himself to rest. Velner station burned behind them as the dropship lifted off, the Drath consuming what remained of the structure with their endless hunger. And Valeth watched through the viewport as everything he had tried to defend disappeared into fire and darkness. But the people had survived. Civilians were safe aboard the command ship. The soldiers were being treated for their wounds. And somewhere in the chaos of the evacuation, life continued despite the mathematics that said it should not. Valeth found a quiet corner of the dropship and began composing his report for Silvery Command, his fingers moving slowly across the datapad as he tried to find words for what he had experienced. "My calculations were wrong," he wrote. "I do not make that statement lightly. As the Silthery have prided ourselves on mathematical precision for 12,000 years. But humans cannot be measured in probability matrices." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "They fight not because the odds favor them, but because they refuse to accept any odds at all. And they feel terror and charge forward anyway. And they see death and choose defiance instead of acceptance." The words felt inadequate, but he continued writing. "I felt terror for the first time today, not the fear of my own death, which I have faced many times without concern, but terror of losing them, terror of watching these impossible creatures fall, terror of a universe that did not include their defiance." Jack approached him then, moving slowly because of his wounds, and sat down on the bench beside Valeth without asking permission. "How are you holding up, Commander?" Jack asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice, genuine care for an alien he had known for less than a day. Valeth considered the question, searching for an honest answer among the chaos of new emotions filling his ancient mind. "I do not know," he admitted finally. but I think I would like to find out. Jack smiled, a tired expression on his bloodied face, and reached out to clasp Velith's shoulder in that gesture of connection the humans seemed to favor. "Welcome to the team," Jack said. Simple Velith returned to his report, adding one final thought before transmitting it to his superiors. "I do not know what I have become," he wrote, "but standing among humans, carrying their terror and their hope together in my chest, I suspect it might be something better than what I was before." He saved the document and looked up to find Katie Mosh, approaching with water and blankets for the survivors, her face tired but her eyes carrying something that looked like hope. "Thank you," Velith said to her, taking the offered water. "For coordinating the extraction," Katie smiled and shook her head. "Thank the soldiers who cleared that hangar," she replied, "because they are the real heroes today." Velith looked around the dropship, at the wounded humans, at the medics working frantically to save lives, at Jack Morrison, who had already fallen asleep against the bulkhead with his rifle still clutched in his hands. Heroes. Katie had called them, and perhaps that was the word Velith had been searching for. The variable his equations had failed to account for humans were not merely soldiers or fighters or tactical assets. They were heroes, beings who defied probability, and laughed at impossible odds and taught ancient species the meaning of terror through their refusal to surrender. Velith closed his eyes and felt the strange new emotions settling into place within his chest. Terror and hope and something else he could not yet name. Something that felt like belonging. He had calculated war for 12,000 years. But today the humans had taught him something that transcended calculation. They had taught him what it meant to care, and perhaps that made all the difference.